Welcome to the Science of Emotions podcast. This is your host, Ruben Singh, MD. In this episode, we'll be discussing the emotion of anger. We'll be utilizing a review article by Human Affectome Project. The article is titled The Feeling of Anger From Brain Networks to Linguistic Expressions. Philosophers have been thinking and reflecting on the emotion of anger for millennia. Seneca wrote a book on anger, reviewing the emotion of anger from the Stoic perspective for about 2,000 years ago. Historical perspective on the study of anger is an interesting topic, but that will be the focus of one of the future episodes. But in this episode, we'll be discussing the feeling of anger from brain networks to linguistic expressions by Human Affectome Project. This review of neuroscience of anger attempts to map anger and its components, including the physiological, cognitive, and experiential components, to the neuroscience literature, including genetic markers, functional imaging of the human brain networks, and to the linguistic expression using the language that we use to describe anger feelings. Following the review of the neuroscience literature, this article reviews the language that we use to convey angry feelings, as well as the metaphors reflecting the inner state of anger experience. Then, towards the end, this article discusses how the linguistic expression, that is, the language that we use, can be mapped onto the neural circuits during anger experience and to the distinct components of anger. They identify the relationship between anger components, brain networks, and other research into emotions relevant to the motivational state of anger, which is the motivation for dominance or basic needs for safety. So let's get started. As an introduction, the feeling of anger is quite specific and practically universal, yet it remains one of the least studied of the basic emotions. Provocation, that is a stimulus that's perceived as threatening or aversive, is a common activator of anger. Regardless of the provocation and the situational trigger, whether it's perceived threat or unfair treatment, anger is couched in distinct internal states that can propagate and escalate in a positive feedback loop. Anger is reflected across distinct components, including the arousal component, as in stress reactivity with concomitant autonomic arousal, cognitive components, including heightened attention to threat, hypervigilance, and hostile attributions. So, what that means is that our autonomic system is in arousal state, and our cognitive components, our thinking, pays more attention to the threat. We become more hypervigilant, and we have a tendency to attribute hostile intention to the provocation or the source of provocation. Now, outward displays embody this specific facial expressions, the bodily displays of threat, and vocal prosody, as well as the standard linguistic expression, which are used to reflect the subjective experience. For example, feeling of being mad, enraged, etc. Now, anger is experienced and expressed across these components, and the self regulation of anger can occur by altering some or all of these components. In modern society, as compared to ancient times when anger expression and display of brute force likely helped establish dominance and determine leadership, anger regulation is increasingly important as one needs to moderate display of anger in order to achieve advantageous outcome. So, in a modern society that we live, the anger regulation is more prized skill that leads to better outcomes compared to ancient times when expression of anger and aggression established a sort of dominance. However, in the escalation of anger, emotional self regulation can fail and displays of anger can culminate into aggressive behavior. This reactive aggression can be so swift as if following a quote unquote low road of brain activity, such that aggression is perpetrated seemingly without observable escalation or mediation of cognitive inhibitions. So, in some cases, we can regulate our response to provocation, but in some quick responses, brain pathways you may use a low road where the self regulatory pathway is bypassed and we lead directly to expression of aggressive behavior. Next, we discuss the components of anger arousal, autonomic stress, reactivity to provocation. Throughout evolution, anger has had an adaptive role in survival, with its fundamental involvement in the fight or flight reaction to threat detection. As such, physiological responses that share phylogenetically similar mechanisms with other mammals constitute the experience of arousal. Autonomic arousal is indicated by a raised heart rate, muscle tone, altered posture, facial expressions due to adrenaline release. And all these serve as arousal displays of anger. Now, although fear shares the feeling component with anger, such as autonomic arousal to threat, organism is motivated to withdraw and flee under fear, unless escape is not possible. But unlike fear, anger is characterized by approach motivation. And if the confrontation is deemed the best course of action, it can help mobilize optimal physiological and cognitive support for action tendencies that promote confronting threat and provocation. Thus, perhaps the initial arousal to threat or provocation develop into fear or anger, depending on the context and personality or trait tendencies. Next, we discuss the cognition, the role of anger in biasing our attention and cognition. Now, autonomic arousal during anger feelings is relatively short lived, whereas the frequent experiences of anger and thoughts about the provoking situation, that is, the anger rumination, enable the persistence of negative emotions. So we may ruminate about pro- the provocation or the initial trigger. During a state of anger, and perhaps more so during repeated and enduring bouts of anger rumination, attention becomes narrowed and intensely focused towards the source of provocation. As such, anger narrows attentional scope, often compromising the efficiency of cognitive processing and decision making. It is suggested that learned bias toward engaging anger in response to stressors can develop as a functional or a function of associative networks and connection across feelings, thoughts, memories, and physiological and expressive motor reactions. Now, rapid unfolding of emotional information through this network promotes rapid interpretation and causal cognitive attributions of the provocation, which facilitates the enhancement of anger. So, this network will promote a rapid interpretation and attribute or assign cause to the provocation. And it keeps kind of getting into this positive upward escalation loop. Next, we discuss the anger regulation. Now, there are different theories about how regulation of our anger works. Some theories argue that regulatory processes are activated at the initiation of anger experience or at the late appraisal stages. However, most agree that processes involved in anger regulation occur at different stages of anger escalation, depending on a multitude of factors, including the degree of emotion regulation capacity. The anger regulation strategy of reappraisal depends on one's ability to distance the self from the provocation or to reevaluation of the provocation as less threatening or frustrating than it is initially perceived. This capacity is sometimes also referred to as anger control, and it can serve to reduce the intensity of anger and prevent escalation to maladaptive behaviors. Because cognitive reappraisal and other high level anger management training heavily rely on intact intellectual and executive functioning, patients suffering from intellectual disabilities or neurodevelopmental disorders can show frequent loss of control. Even with the intact intelligence and despite the availability of cognitive strategies as a reprisal, high level of arousal and stress reactivity induced during anger can challenge the ability to constrain its expression. In particular, uncontrollable anger situation may trigger a quote unquote low road of activation, with minimal mediation by high order cognition. And this can rapidly lead to anger displays and aggression. Some researchers argue that intense frustration triggers anger, leading to reactive aggression in animals when there is a high level of danger and the threat is very close. In humans, whether stemming from frustration or other perceived threat, anger often requires some degree of regulation. However, inhibiting effects of prefrontal cortex recruitment during such times of intense and negatively balanced approach emotion may be greatly weakened or circumvented. This concept of low road that can lead to rapid displays of anger and aggression is adapted from fear studies, which have found that a specific fear response reflects an automatic process that does not even require conscious recognition of the feared stimulus. Thus, fear reactions, as well as anger, are partly managed by our ancient brain systems, primarily the amygdala, that may act relatively independently of the later emerging higher cognitions. Also, notably, the use of psychoactive substances such as alcohol can escalate feelings of anger and facilitate the low road to rapid aggressive responses. Sleep restriction also intensifies anger, perhaps by reducing tolerance for provocation. Next, we discuss the physiological and behavioral displays of anger. Anger signals are recognized in humans, especially the facial and bodily expressions that exaggerate perception of physical strength and fighting ability, analogous to the animals that bear their fangs. Indeed, the facial displays of anger often include jaw clenching, indicating readiness to attack. Face displays of anger are already functional at 6 months of age and may demonstrate cross cultural uniformity in its basic elements. As an example, congenitally blind children produce normal anger facial expression. However, it should be noted that although anger displays are part of the universal species, typical systems that evolved by natural selection, these are partly calibrated by cultural variation. Linguistic expressions are also part of the human display of anger. Anger prosody of sound and tone, as well as angry language indicating escalations, are used as a communication of anger in humans. Together, these facial, bodily, and language displays, like raising the voice, pounding on the table, shaking a fist, breaking something, physically assaulting, allow for a rapid exchange of information about the ability to inflict cause on the provocateur. Next, we discuss the disease correlates of chronic anger. Enduring propensity to anger feelings is characterized by high trait anger in the literature. Trait anger has been related to chronic disease and negative consequences to one's own health, well being, and social support. In fact, the disproportionate and pathological manifestations of anger are a cross diagnostic feature of many psychiatric disorders. And anger is known as an emotion that exacerbates mental health symptoms and complicates psychiatric recovery. Now, importantly, these detrimental manifestations of anger do not only express themselves in psychiatric symptoms, but also may result in chronic diseases of the heart and digestive system, as well as the immune systems. Due at least in part to the chronic arousal and hypervigilance associated with the anger experiences, combined with the high cognitive and physiological resources needed to downregulate such chronic anger. Several pathways linking anger to chronic disease states have been explored in studies. First, anger may influence the health status and disease processes through its effects on inflammation. Anger has been associated with increased circulating inflammatory and coagulation markers such as interleukin 6, which is a pro-inflammatory cytokine, and fibrinogen. Specifically, both trait anger and outward displays of anger, like yelling, slamming doors, have been associated with higher interleukin 6 and fibrinogen, whereas better anger control and reappraisal predicts lower interleukin 6, at least among women. Socioeconomic status, which is a broad concept including educational attainment, sociocultural variables, and ethnicity, has also been shown to moderate the relationship between anger and inflammation. Second, the chronic and acute episodes of anger can be detrimental to the cardiovascular system and is considered the most robust personality related predictor of cardiovascular disease. The risk of cardiovascular event following outbursts of anger has been examined in a meta analysis. Based on the totality of evidence, in a 2 hour following episodes of anger, there is a significant risk of myocardial infarction, acute coronary syndrome, ischemic and hemorrhagic stroke, arrhythmia, among individuals at a risk of a cardiovascular event. However, impacts of anger outbursts may be modified by trait anger, since the individual with an angry temperament showing chronically high level of physiological arousal and stress reactivity, and person with traits characterized by anger, like type A personality, are considered coronary prone. Experiences of competitiveness and angry, hostile, and distrusting dispositions require high level of vigilance, resulting in prolonged neurohormonal activation conducive to atherosclerosis and coronary disease. It has been shown that the sympathetic effects and increased cardiac output prevail in the context of harassment and personalized recall of anger events. Thus, the persistent and pervasive action of physiological arousal sustained by the emotion of anger can well explain the consistent relationship between anger, cardiovascular disease, and hypertension. Indeed, several studies have shown that high levels of both expressed and suppressed anger predict risk of hypertension and stroke across cultures, as well as the increased risk of recurrent cardiac event and earlier mortality among patients with previous coronary artery disease. Third, anger has been associated with motility, functional gastrointestinal disorders, and to visceral and pain hypersensitivity, as shown for other negative emotions. For example, anger control and suppression, consisting of cognitive and behavioral efforts to restrain angry feelings, are associated with prolonged gastric emptying and a delayed gut transit. These effects likely mediated by corticotropin releasing factor, which is involved in the central stress response, are probably a way to prevent digestion during stressful period when energy is better spent on defense. For example, patients with irritable bowel syndrome have been shown to display increased anger as well as colonic motor activity and decreased antral motor activity during experimental anger provoking conditions compared to healthy controls. Next, we discuss the neuroscience of anger, the measurement of phenotype in humans. In human studies, a self report is the predominant way in which anger is operationalized, although autonomic response, electrophysiological brain changes, and facial coding have also been used in the context of experimental provocation or mood inductions. On the self report assessments, individuals are simply asked to endorse degree to which they feel angry or endorse other statements or phrases that commonly describe the feeling, like, quote, I feel like a keg ready to explode, unquote. The state trait anger expression inventory, also known as STAXI, STAXI, is probably the most widely used questionnaire of the state and trait anger. It has been used in genetic, neuroimaging, cardiovascular, behavioral studies for decades, and has been translated into several languages. STAXI, that is the State Trait Anger Expression Inventory, assesses seven facets of the anger. Those facets are: one, state anger. It's like a question asking, how do you feel right now? Second, the trait anger, which can be elicited by a question like, how do you usually feel? Next, it studies anger in, when anger is expressed inwardly. This can be elicited by asking questions like, quote, I boil inside but do not show it, unquote. Anger out, that is, anger that's expressed outwardly. Quote, this can be elicited by questions like, quote, I do things like slam doors, unquote. Then next component is angry temperament. Statements like, quote, I feel a fiery temper. Angry reaction is the next component. I get angry when I'm slowed down. And anger control is the last component, with statements like, quote, I keep my cool, unquote. So these are the instruments or the inventory that are used in different studies, questionnaires that are used in various genetic neuroimaging studies. Now, genetic components of anger, now we're going to be discussing. Twin studies have ascertained that variance among individuals in anger and anger related personality traits can be explained both by genetic and environmental factors. For example, genetically informed studies have found that heritability rates for state anger and anger out are moderate, and higher heritability has been reported for anger control. Now, this review uh, of the genetic components linking anger to specific genotypes or polymorphisms was based on a literature search from PubMed. Now, it was seen that when the different studies were reviewed, the candidate gene approach versus whole genome approach have been preferred method to investigate the genetic basis of anger. As a consequence, only a few candidate genes belonging to monoamine pathways have been studied, but many others still remain to be investigated. Now, these studies about the genetics involved mostly healthy subjects and individuals with a history of suicide attempts. Both in healthy controls and suicide attempters, variation in nucleotide sequence of specific genes belonging to serotonergic and catecholaminergic pathways known to play key role in the impulse control disorders, and aggressive behaviors have been implicated in individual differences in anger and anger related traits. But most of these studies showed very conflicting correlational results, suggesting that larger sample as well as correcting for confounding factors including ancestry, age, gender, and the influence of environmental factors are needed to confirm results. Indeed, there's been a considerable critique of the candidate gene studies as they've suffered poor applicability, likely reflecting a publication bias. Now, openly available data secured from the database of genotypes and phenotypes were analyzed for genome wide association, that's GWA, studies of proneness to anger using the Staxi questionnaire. They observed only one nominally significant finding on chromosome 6q21 in the gene coding for non receptor protein tyrosine kinase. FIN, that's FI, and FIN signaling pathway regulating intracellular calcium homeostasis, which are relevant to memory, learning, and neuronal survivals, may in part may underlie the expression of angry temperament. Nonetheless, mostly non significant findings of this genome wide association study with very large sample size further call in question the candidate gene findings. It's been suggested that epigenetics may be a better and more dynamic approach to identifying genetic links to anger. Epigenetics is the gene regulatory effect that can be variable or change based on the life circumstances. And actually can pass from one generation to next without any changes in uh, genetic code. However, very little data exists on the epigenetic mechanisms underlying anger and anger related personality traits. Only one study reported an association between anger and high levels of methylation within the promoter region of oxytocin receptor gene, which has been associated with increased activity of amygdala in response to angry faces. Next, we discuss the brain networks that are involved in the anger studies and human anger experience. These are based on functional MRI studies. One of the first brain network that's been shown to be involved is called the salience network. The salience network consists of dorsal anterior cingulate cortex, anterior insular cortex, as well as the cortical areas, including the parts of thalamus, amygdala, and the brainstem dedicated to detecting behaviorally relevant salient changes in the internal states and any threatening external stimuli. In the studies reviewed in this review article, anger induction was linked to activation of anterior insula, thalamus, and amygdala. In concert, these brain regions facilitate the autonomic arousal, interoception, and activation of the stress response upon recognition of threat or provocation. Another dominant network in anger induction is the default mode network, that is also called mentalizing network. Mentalizing activates the midline, parietal, and frontal areas, including the precuneus, posterior cingulate cortex, and dorsal medial PFC, that's dorsal medial prefrontal cortex, as well as lateral temporoparietal areas. These midline areas of the so called default mode network are active during rest and have been associated with self referential processing. In several of the reviewed studies, anger experience activated primarily the posterior cingulate cortex and precuneus of the mentalizing network, suggesting the engagement of self referential mental imagery. The next network that's involved is called self regulatory or self regulation network, also known as executive network, consists of medial and lateral prefrontal cortex areas, including ventromedial PFC, rostral anterior cingulate cortex, inferior frontal gyrus, and dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. Anger feelings induced by mental imagery and autobiographical recall activated the ventromedial PFC, frontal, inferior frontal, and dorsolateral PFC. A recent crossover sham controlled double blind simultaneous fMRI and brain stimulation study supports a potential causal role of ventromedial PFC in anger regulation. There also seems to be a crosstalk between salience and regulation networks as increased functional connectivity has been observed between amygdala and inferior frontal gyrus after anger induction in the healthy individuals. So these networks are being studied, and the understanding of these networks and their interactions is progressing rapidly in scientific literature, although there's a lot still to be understood, but there seems to be a sort of interplay between salience network, default mode network, and central executive network. So, salience network determines that if something externally is relevant as a threat, that it's relevant or salient to one's integrity. Now, default mode network is active during rest, but it also has a function in self-referential, that how something externally is related to self from past or memory. So that self-referential work, self-referential aspect of default mode network, or uh, mentalizing network, can lead to rumination. So in normal or in a regulatory framework, salience network switches off, the default mode network, and enhances the central executive control network. And this interaction, although a lot of it still needs further exploration and study, but there may be uh, inter-individual, how different people differ from each other in the interplay between these different networks, where some people may be better able to distance themselves from self-referential salience of external threat, but others may start keep ruminating and escalate into positive cycle where the displays of anger leading to aggression can occur. So this is an exciting area, the network approach rather than the domain or specific parts of brain like amygdala or prefrontal cortex. Instead of the those areas, it's a network approach that is more promising, and how the interplay between these networks may enhance the regulatory outcomes versus leading to an expression of anger or an aggression display. Now, next we discuss internally versus externally induced anger. From the review of literature in this article, it was noted that experimental paradigms using anger inductions are either internally or externally generated. Internal induction procedures rely on each individual's mental imagery or recall of autobiographical memories, and are associated with activation of insular and limbic subcortical parts of the salience network. In particular, but also in the parietal parts of mentalizing network, ventromedial and ventrolateral PFC of the self-regulation network, as well as the striatal habit network. External induction procedure induce anger by provocation from outside, for example, by unfair monetary offers, social exclusions, frustrating unsolvable tasks, and insults. Notably, both anger induction approaches activate similar networks, but external induction shows a more widespread activation, tending to activate dorsal anterior cingulate cortex, possibly due to conflict between wanting to perform well in the task at hand and distraction by the social provocation. Across the induction types, whether internally or externally induced, pattern of activation relevant to self-regulation network, including the ventromedial PFC, inferior frontal gyrus, and dorsolateral PFC, was common in all induction. In line with the recently proposed domain journal scaffolding on how the human brain constructs an experience of anger. Now, this next we discuss the summary of neurobiology of anger, common and unique elements of feeling. Now, genetically informed studies have found that heritability rates of state or the trait anger are moderate, but higher heritability has been proposed or reported for anger control. Nevertheless, the review of polymorphism or the whole genome associated with anger are limited by the small sample size and candidate genes. Therefore, nothing much can be summarized except for noting that more studies should be needed, or more studies are needed to ascertain the genetic correlates of anger. It's difficult to separate anger from its common consequences, that is, aggression, and to separate anger from other negative feelings, fear, for example, which is also induced by perceived threat, to understand the unique dynamics and the neurobiology of anger. Other negative feelings cause individuals to withdraw. Fear, sadness, and disgust propel individual away from the provocation and often show right lateralization in EEG. Now, fMRI review produced that clear left lateralization, particularly in the mentalizing and self-regulatory network, but also in salience network involving left lateralized insula activation during anger. This is reminiscent of anger's general motivational orientation towards approach behavior, with left lateralized asymmetry during anger. So, compared to other negative feelings, which like sadness or fear, which are propelling the individual away from the provocation, anger propels the person towards the provocation because of the left lateralization. Researchers have found the increased activation of left anterior cortical areas during actual experience of anger. This left lateralization is quite unique to anger, reflecting a readiness to confront the source of provocation. Now, whether discrete emotions correspond to discrete brain regions or to generalized brain networks, it is apparent that experience of anger in correlation with the trait anger involve multiple brain regions from networks that may be linked back to the elements of anger. For example, salience network with arousal and autonomic arousal. Most studies documented an enhancement of the limbic and other region of salience network with concomitant impairment in the self-regulation and mentalizing network. With some studies showing the structural impairment in some of these networks. The emergent pattern validates the theories on reactive aggression. Yet this pattern is also common in addiction and other externalizing behavior disorders. Possibly the self regulation impairment is overlapping externalizing disorders, while disproportionate emotional response involves different subcortical regions and different phenotypes. Nevertheless, there are not enough studies to substantiate a region specific uniqueness to anger. The network activation are reminiscent of feeling states during appetitive or rewarding cues when wanting is stronger than liking, a- as in the addiction to substances. Indeed, the conflict between the desire to retaliate and self regulation induced by the feeling of anger suggests that these feelings have reinforcing properties. And in order to stop escalating towards unwanted behaviors, prefrontal cortex brain networks are actively recruited to regulate choices and behaviors associated with anger feelings. Next, we discuss the linguistic themes of feeling angry. What language and words we use. And this was based on a research component of Human Affectome Project. Using the definition of feelings as a starting point, linguistic team of the Human Affectome Project undertook a formal linguistic analysis and ultimately proposed nine broad categories of feeling states. In this particular review, the extracted for the anger category were summarized, and it was discovered that anger words could generally be grouped along a continuum that refer to degree of arousal, the speed of escalation, outward displays, and the source of provocation. The degree of arousal is a very important component of anger feelings, as reviewed above in this research paper. Now, the degree of anger was reflected in terms that we use. For example, mild anger could be described as being annoyed. At one extreme, an intense anger, like a feeling of fury, at the most other extreme, with moderate level of anger conveyed as by words like angry. The linguistic expression of arousal tended to operate within a temperature metaphor, such as in heat escalation, boiling up. Speed in which anger escalates and is expressed reflect the components of displays and regulation of anger. Is another notable observation that came from the analysis of anger words. A gradual escalation of anger is expressed as a building of pressure or bringing the internal state to a boiling point. Also notable were anger words senses that refer to anger related displays, for example, rancorous, and the behavior outbursts, for example, rage. Lastly, some words were related to the different sources of provocation that reflected attribution about the social provocations, such as experiences of social threats, for example, alienation, or unfair treatment, like indignation. and the resulting feeling of anger directed at the sources of those threats: animosity, misanthropy. So these are the linguistic or the language words that we use can show the speed at which anger escalates, the degree of anger, and the sources of provocation. Next, this article discusses the motivators of anger, recognizes two predominant motivators for anger: one, need for safety, and others, need for dominance and reward. It is argued that anger had an adaptive role in improving conditions for the optimal life, fitness, and survival. As with fear, anger can also be motivated by a need for safety. There is a functional logic underlying the anger and motivation to use anger depending on perceived formidability of the target or threat. So thus the anger is displayed to compel a target to bargain so as to avoid the threat posed by anger and to incentivize the target to withdraw. And there is a recalibration theory of anger that is described as an attempt to reverse engineer anger. In essence, the theory posits that anger is a response designed to bargain for better treatment. At the same time, anger can be an effective instrument of threat for the purpose of intimidation and domination of others. The superordinate goal of this action tendency is to obtain control. And the primary action employed to achieve this goal are attacking, intimidating, hurting, biting, scratching, reactance. Indeed, the anger that is elicited by a provoking situation is predicted by higher behavioral activation but not by behavioral inhibition scores, and comprises the pursuit of appetitive goals, responsiveness to reward, and a tendency to seek out new reinforcers and act quickly. Interestingly, children who tended to react exuberantly to emotionally positive situation at age 5 were also more anger prone in negative situation, and positive emotion exuberance significantly predictive externalizing problems 2 or 3 years later. Next, we discuss the cultural variation in anger, feelings, and displays. The recalibration theory of anger describes anger as a social bargaining tool. Displaying anger is purportedly designed to gather the target's attention, and most common response to anger is a rapid information exchange. Theory holds that apologies typically extinguish anger. From this perspective, anger responses coordinate facial expression, vocal changes, verbal arguments, the withholding of benefits, deployment of aggression, and a suite of other cognitive and physiological variables in the service of leveraging bargaining position into better outcomes. There was a recent study that was conducted that used 23 experiments to test the theory's prediction about anger using participants from United States, Australia, Turkey, Romania, India, Ecuador. Using the vignettes describing anger induction scenarios, the team found that subjects across all six cultures judged the anger would intensify when 1. The cost was large, the benefit the offender received from imposing the cost was small, or the offender imposed the cost despite knowing that angered individual was the person to be harmed. So this theoretical framework for anger appears to have a degree of validity across different cultures. Now, although the anger is evident across most cultures, anger responses are highly contextualized and therefore subject to variation across cultures. Distinct cultural variation in anger have been shown in research. For example, it was recently in one of the studies recently compared the anger response differences between American and Japanese respondents in a study designed to explore the transformation of high intensity shame into anger, a phenomenon known as humiliated fury. The research team conducted two studies and compared the occurrence of shame related anger in North American cultural contexts, where shame is devalued and anger is valued, to its occurrence in Japanese culture, where shame is valued and anger is devalued. In both these studies, shame predicted anger for American respondents but not Japanese participants. Japanese respondents only reported shame related anger when presented with North American cultural context, suggesting that shame related anger is a cultural or culture specific phenomena. One Another fMRI study scanned the Chinese and German healthy subjects to determine whether or not these cultural differences would foster distinct brain activity. Analysis revealed that several brain regions that showed comparable hemodynamic responses across groups. However, their results confirmed some cross cultural differences, specifically enhanced emotion regulation mediated by left dorsolateral PFC during empathy to anger phases among participants from interdependent cultures versus individualized cultures. The tolerance of anger in the individualized culture was associated with increased activity of the right inferior and superior temporal gyrus and the left medial insula. Together, these results support the features of anger experience across are common across cultures, but other elements of distinctions in processing of anger across cultures with different worldviews. So some of the components of anger are common, but other elements of anger vary across cultures with different worldviews. So, in conclusion, this review article summarizes that chronic anger is a ubiquitous experience in some individuals, is associated with the development and worsening of major disease states. Anger is common in numerous disorders, although there's only one disorder that's specifically related to anger, and it's intermittent explosive disorder. In summary, regulating and coping with the anger is crucial for the brain and reducing psychiatric problems, and for the other organs in the body, making a strong case for appropriate anger regulation generally being more advantageous to optimal living than the chronic anger expressions. Now, from the genetic markers of the anger traits, it's the summary revealed that some monoamine candidate gene studies were uh, observed, but those were limited by small sample size, and there's been significant criticism based on the lack of replicability. One genome wide study found a link with FIN, that's FIN, FIN signaling pathway, although the effect size was quite small. So, this review concludes that more genetic and epigenetic studies are needed that are genome wide using large sample and varied population to ascertain the full picture. In the second literature review, the fMRI studies of human brain networks were summarized, and it reviewed what networks activated specifically during experimentally induced anger feelings. These networks correspond nicely to the components of anger that were introduced in the earlier review. Salience networks, amygdala and insula involvement captured the component of autonomic arousal and stress reactivity. Mentalizing network, that's default mode network, captured the cognitive components and self-referential anger experiences. And the interaction between salience and self-regulation and mentalizing network through connectivity of the ventromedial prefrontal cortex with thalamus and insula. And further, there is a strong left lateralization in activity and suppressed brain networks, possibly as a result of the strong approach tendency in anger feelings. Also, notably, anger feelings appear to trigger opposing processes between prefrontal cortex, top down control, and subcortical limbic pressure. Particularly compelling, a recent study demonstrated that modulating activity in ventromedial prefrontal cortex with transcranial direct current stimulation led to decreased aggression, retribution, and mitigated the increase in self reported anger following provocation. Now, just as anger triggers specific body and brain responses, anger is expressed through specific language in humans. It was observed that anger words could generally be grouped along a continuum that referred to degree of arousal, speed of escalation, type of anger display, and the source of provocation. Linguistic expression captured the arousal and pressure terms and also the loss of regulation. Language also reflects the difference Different, possibly, sources of provocation and attribution about the social situations that may lead to anger, such as being ignored or alienated. Despite these interpretations of the literature, research is not available available that explicitly tests association between language displays and particular patterns of neural activation or arousal. These types of studies would in future advance the knowledge of the ways in which the language reflects the psychobiological experiences of humans. Language analysis further suggests that anger is motivated by both a need for safety and need for dominance, depending on individual personality traits and on the situation at the hand. Thus, anger is expressed to manage fear, for example, to reduce threat to safety, or to increase the sense of reward from the act of dominating others. So, this, in a sense, concludes the review article on anger. The takeaway point for me seems to be that although the genetic study seems to be a limited and no candidate genes are kind of forthcoming based on current evidence, heritability of anger control is higher than heritability of state and trait anger. Further, interesting component was the the interplay between different networks and how these different network and interplay may exhibit the differences in how some individuals may be able to better manage the regulatory part of anger after provocation. Others may lead to ruminations. And also the other component was the chronic health effects of persistent anger expression, especially cardiovascular, gastrointestinal, and immune responses from the chronic inflammatory response from the anger states. Well, this was that gets us to the end of this episode. I hope you guys enjoyed it. We'll look forward to seeing you again during the next episodes.